That night she stood beneath the chandeliers and said, 10 years is enough. I want someone younger, someone richer. The laughter stopped, but her smile didn't. I walked up, took the microphone, and said one line that turned the room into stone. What happened after wasn't about money at all. It was about truth and the price of pretending. The night began like celebration and ended like confession. It was the 10th anniversary of my company Miller & Sons Restoration, a business I built from a truck, a toolbox, and a promise to my father that I would never work for a man who didn't value his hands. 200 guests filled the ballroom, their laughter ringing off crystal and chandeliers. The smell of champagne mixed with the sound of money talking. The kind of music that only those who never knew silence can dance to. Maria was beautiful that night. She always was. Her red dress caught every beam of light and threw it back like a signal flare. She moved through the crowd as if she owned it, smiling, laughing, touching arms, collecting admiration like tips. When she met my eyes from across the room, the look was polite, not personal. I should have noticed it then, the distance between her smile and her soul. At 55, I was still the same man who used to come home smelling of paint and dust, who measured worth by effort, not brand names. But Maria had grown used to silk and sparkle. When the years had softened my hair to salt and pepper, she called it distinguished. When they softened our marriage, she called it boring. The band was playing a slow song when I saw her checking her phone again. A small smile, quick, private. Not for me. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the stage. I thought she wanted to thank me for the party. I was wrong. She took the microphone like a queen accepting a crown. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice clear, elegant. "I just want to say how proud I am of John. 10 years of hard work, 10 years of success, and 10 years of marriage to a man who still believes in saving receipts." The crowd laughed. She paused, let the sound wash over her, then added, 10 years is a long time. Maybe long enough. The room shifted. Even the band fell silent. Maria looked at me with the kind of calm that comes after a decision, not before it. "I want to feel young again," she said. "I want a life that doesn't measure dinners by discounts. I want a man who can buy me what I deserve without asking how much it costs." I heard a glass drop. Someone whispered my name. The rest was static. A year's of sacrifice, compressed into one public sentence. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe until she smiled and said, "So, tonight in front of all of you, I'm choosing to start over." There are moments in a man's life when rage and clarity arrive together. Mine came wearing a black tie. I stood slowly, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the microphone. Every eye followed me, like a slow funeral procession. "Thank you, Maria," I said. The microphone echoed my calm. "You've always had a way with timing. 10 years ago, you walked into my life when I had nothing. Tonight, you're walking out now that you think you've found something better." No one breathed. She looked at me, eyes narrow, but mouth smiling, the smile people use when they still believe they control the narrative. "You want a man who won't count pennies," I continued. "Then you might need to find one who doesn't depend on mine." The room froze. A waiter stopped mid-step. Someone coughed and then apologized for breathing. Maria's lip trembled, but she didn't speak. I handed the microphone back to the Sioux, walked off the stage, and poured myself a drink. Whiskey. No ice. I wanted to taste the burn. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the band was packing up, a young employee approached me. "Mr. Miller," he said, hesitant, "I'm sorry for what happened." I smiled and shook my head. "Don't be. You just saw the most expensive lesson a man can learn, that love without respect is credit without limit. Eventually, someone has to pay." When I stepped outside, the air was cold and clean. The night sky didn't care who was younger or richer. It was just honest. And for the first time in years, so was I. The next morning, she would learn what happens when a man who builds everything from nothing finally decides to start over. The ride home felt longer than the years that built it. Maria sat in silence beside me, her perfume still sharp in the air, but the warmth behind it was gone. The city lights slid across the windshield like streaks of guilt neither of us wanted to name. I kept my hands on the wheel, steady, calm, as if control over the car could make up for the control I had just lost over everything else. When we pulled into the driveway, she exhaled like she had been holding her breath the entire ride. The house looked different that night. Same walls, same lights, but the kind of quiet that follows when the truth has already broken through. She stepped out first, heel tapping the stone path toward the door. Inside, the air felt thick, heavy, with something you couldn't dust off or sweep away. She turned to me, her voice low, trembling between fury and fear. "How could you embarrass me like that, John? In front of everyone." I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. "Embarrass you?" I said quietly. "You stood in front of 200 people and told them you were leaving me for a fantasy with better pockets." "That's not what I said." "It's what you meant." Her hands were shaking, but she hid them behind her back, like she was still holding her pride there. "You made me look pathetic." I walked past her into the living room. The same living room I had painted myself. The same fireplace I built brick by brick after our wedding. "You didn't need my help to look that way," I said. She flinched. For a moment, I thought she would cry. But pride has thicker skin than regret. She followed me, voice rising. "You think you're so noble, John. You think working late, coming home tired, saving every dollar makes you a saint. But I'm tired of being grateful for the bare minimum. I turned then. Bare minimum, I whispered. I gave you everything I knew how to give. I didn't buy you the world because I thought you already had one. The clock on the wall ticked between us like a metronome for the silence that followed. She looked away first. I met someone, she said finally. His name is Mark. He's younger. He makes me feel alive again. There it was, the confession without shame, the knife without apology. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just nodded because something inside me had already died at the party. How long, I asked. 6 months, she said, looking at the floor. It's not what you think. No, I said. It's exactly what I think. I walked to my study, opened the drawer, and pulled out a folder. The kind of folder that ends illusions. Inside were photos, receipts, screenshots I had known for months. I had just wanted to see how far she'd go before she tripped over her own lies. John, she whispered when she saw the papers. You had me followed. I had my doubts followed, I said. You confirmed the rest. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the kind that ask for forgiveness. They were the kind that ask for negotiation. We can fix this, she said. We just need time. I shook my head slowly. Time is the one thing we already spent, and you can't refund trust. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage. I looked at her, really looked, and realized she was right about one thing. She had been invisible. But not because I couldn't see her. Because she had been performing so long there was no one left to see. You stopped being invisible, I said, the moment you decided to make me your audience instead of your husband. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the half-open window. I'll pack my things in the morning, she finally said, her voice breaking on the word morning. Tonight, I replied. You'll pack tonight. She looked up startled. You can't just throw me out. I'm not throwing you out, Maria. You already walked out hours ago. You just hadn't reached the door yet. The color drained from her face. She turned away, walking up the stairs slowly, like each step was a memory cracking under her heels. I stood there listening to the faint sounds of drawers opening, suitcases unzipping, zippers closing. Each sound was a decade, collapsing quietly. An hour later, the bedroom door upstairs shut one final time. I sat down on the couch, poured another glass of whiskey, and stared at the fireplace. The flames oozed like they were whispering something ancient, something my father might have said if he were still alive. When a man builds something from nothing, he used to tell me he learns to tell the difference between what can be rebuilt and what should be left as ruins. That night I understood. Love wasn't meant to be rebuilt out of debris. It was meant to be remembered for the structure it once was, and then left behind when it collapsed under its own weight. Outside, I heard the suitcase wheels rolling down the path. The engine started. Then silence. Again. A new kind of silence, clean and unbroken. I sat there until the fire burned down to embers, until the house finally stopped smelling like her perfume. And for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of the quiet. Because the quiet finally belonged to me. Morning light slipped through the curtains like it didn't know what had happened the night before. The house was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows bass, but the kind that follows an explosion. The coffee machine clicked on automatically at 7. Maria used to love that sound. She said it made the house feel alive. Now it just reminded me that routines outlive people. Her perfume still lingered in the air, faint and ghostly. There was a note on the kitchen counter, written on the same expensive stationery she used for party invitations. This isn't over. No greeting, no signature, just that. I smiled without meaning to. People who lose control always think it isn't over. But the truth is, it ends the moment they stop deciding what's next. I poured my coffee black, no sugar. It tasted bitter grounding. That's what truth does when it's still new. It burns on the way down, then it steadies you. By the time I reached my office, Sarah, my assistant for 12 years, was already there. Her eyes said more than her voice. "Rough night, sir?" she asked softly. I nodded. You could say that. She hesitated, holding a folder against her chest. "I thought you should see this." Inside were screenshots of posts from people who had been at the party. Videos, comments, half-blurred photos of me standing at the microphone. CEO's wife dumps him mid-speech. The calmest man I've ever seen. The internet has a way of turning pain into entertainment. I set the folder down. "Lock all joint accounts," I said. "Cancel every card with her name on it. And call the bank, freeze the transfers. Today." Sarah didn't flinch. Understood. She paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, John." "Don't be. Just make sure she learns what enough really means." By noon, Maria's calls started coming in. First her cell, then my office, then the company line. I didn't pick up. I didn't have to. Her silence last night had already said everything. People think closure is a conversation. It's not. It's a decision you make, alone usually, while the other person is still trying to explain themselves. When Sarah told me she'd tried using her cards at the Hilton downtown, I almost laughed. They declined her payment, she said. She told the hotel manager there must be a mistake. There wasn't. That evening I sat in my office, long after everyone else had left. The city outside my window glowed with a kind of beauty that only distance can give you. You stop hearing the noise, and all that's left is light and movement, order disguised as chaos. It reminded me of something my father used to say. People show their worth when you stop paying for their comfort. I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were documents Maria never knew existed. Property deeds, investment portfolios, bank statements. Miller and Sons Restoration wasn't my only business. It wasn't even my biggest. It was the visible part of a much deeper foundation, one my father started decades ago under a different name, Miller Holdings and Trust. I'd kept it private for a reason. Not because I didn't trust people, but because I had learned long ago that some people only love what they can see, not what they can feel. Maria was one of them. I still remember the first time she asked, "Why don't you ever show off what you've built?" "John," I told her, "because the only people worth impressing never asked to see proof." She laughed then. She doesn't laugh anymore. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I ignored it, finished my drink, and stared at the framed photo on my desk, me and Maria on our wedding day. We looked happy. Maybe we were. Or maybe we were just two people mistaking comfort for love. I opened the safe behind the bookshelf where my father's papers still smelled faintly of dust and cedar. He had always been cautious, always planning for the unseen storm. Now I understood why. Inside was a smaller folder labeled simply Inheritance Contingency. Everything he built, real estate, shares, trust accounts, had been placed in my name long before Maria entered my life. And because of that, everything she thought she could take had never truly been mine to give. I closed the safe and leaned back. For the first time in days, I exhaled fully. Not relief clarity, the kind that hurts at first, then cleans you out from the inside. Later that night, I drove home. The house felt different. In the dark, emptier, but somehow larger. I walked through each room, slowly touching the walls, the furniture, the echoes of a life that was already history. When I reached the bedroom, her side of the closet was empty. But on the dresser, she had left something I didn't expect, her wedding ring. I held it up under the lamplight. It looked small, not in size, but in meaning. Funny how something can lose all its weight the moment truth enters the room. I placed it inside the same box where I kept my father's old wristwatch, the one he gave me when I opened the business. Both symbols of promises kept and promises broken. Before turning off the light, I whispered to myself, "Let go quietly, John. Don't ruin your peace trying to prove you were right." Outside, the rain started to fall, soft, steady, patient. And as it tapped against the windows, I realized that rebuilding my life wouldn't begin with vengeance or victory. It would begin with stillness. Because sometimes the sound of rain on an empty house is the first honest applause a man ever gets. The next morning, the phone rang again before sunrise. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Some voices don't need numbers anymore. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I poured my coffee and watched the world outside turn gold in the first light. Funny how quiet the world feels when someone finally stops pretending to love you. By mid-morning, Sarah stepped into my office, holding her phone awkwardly like it was something burning. "She's outside, John," she said. "She's been waiting in the lobby for almost an hour." I looked up from my desk. "Send her up." When Maria walked in, she didn't look like the woman who'd left 2 nights ago. The red dress was gone, replaced by a plain sweater and jeans. Her hair was tied back, her eyes tired, but still searching for an angle. The kind of look people have when they realize charm no longer opens doors. "John, please." She started, her voice small. "The hotel said my cards were declined. My phone bill's due. There's some mistake." "There's no mistake," I said. "You wanted freedom. This is what it costs." She blinked as if trying to decide whether to cry or negotiate. "You can't just cut me off." "I'm your wife." "You were," I corrected. "Now you're just someone learning how to live without me." Her lip trembled. "I never meant for things to happen like this. I felt trapped." "Trapped?" I leaned back in my chair. "Trapped in a house you didn't pay for, driving cars you didn't buy, wearing dresses funded by people you never met. That kind of prison, huh?" Her eyes filled with tears. I almost pitied her. Almost. But pity isn't compassion. It's the polite version of distance. "I don't want your money," she said finally. "I just need time." "Time's the one thing you spent without thinking," I said quietly. "And it's the only thing I can't give you back." She sat down across from me, shoulders shaking. "You've changed, John. You're cruel now." I shook my head. "No. I'm clear now. There's a difference." She looked around my office at the photos on the wall, the framed articles, the quiet power of a man she had underestimated. Then she noticed the folder open on my desk. "What's that?" she asked. "Truth," I said simply. "The part of me you never bothered to see." She reached for the folder, but I placed my hand over it. "You spent 10 years with me, Maria, and never once asked what Miller and Sons really was. You thought it was the empire. It was just the surface." Her voice dropped. "What do you mean?" I turned the folder toward her. Documents, figures, names she didn't recognize. "Miller Holdings," I said. "The trust my father built long before we met. You thought you married a man with a business. You married a man with a foundation that owns 10 of them." She stared at the numbers, her hands trembling. "This can't be real." "It's real," I said. "You walked away from a fortune because you couldn't see past a credit card statement." Her voice cracked. "If I had known." I stopped her. "You would have stayed, loved me harder, smiled longer. You don't build love on discovery. You build it on faith." The silence between us stretched long and painful. Finally, she whispered, "We can still fix this." I made a mistake. "No," I said, standing. "You made a trade. And now you're realizing the exchange rate." Her tears finally fell. She reached out, but I stepped back. "Maria, I don't hate you," I said softly. I just can't save you from the choices you celebrated. You. She nodded slowly, wiping her face. You really mean it. You're done. I was done the moment you looked at me and saw a wallet instead of a man. She stood there for a moment, lost between apology and pride. Then she picked up her purse, straightened her jacket, and walked out without another word. When the door closed, the air shifted. It wasn't relief. It was release, the kind that feels heavy before it feels clean. I sank into my chair, staring at the folder she'd touched. The edges were still warm from her hands, but the papers inside were cold. I thought about my father again. How he used to warn me that wealth was like light. It shows the truth, but it also attracts the wrong kind of eyes. He once told me, when you hide your worth, you find out who loves the man, not the mirror. He was right. Maria loved the mirror, and mirrors always break when you stop looking at them. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove to the small diner by the river, the one that stayed open late for truckers and night shift workers. It smelled like coffee and honesty, things you can't fake. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, poured me a cup without asking. Rough night, she said. Rough week, I replied. Then you're still ahead, she said with a smile, and walked away. I sat there for an hour, listening to the quiet hum of the radio, and realized how strange peace feels when you haven't known it for years. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, sits down beside you, and waits to see if you'll recognize it. For the first time in a long time, I did. That night when I came home, the house greeted me with its new kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was honest. The lights in the hallway glowed soft and golden, like the house itself was trying to apologize for holding our memories too long. I walked past the dining room, the place where we'd once celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and even quiet Tuesdays when life still felt simple. The chairs were still where she left them, but the table seemed larger now, like it was finally breathing after years of pretending to hold us together. I poured myself a drink and sat in my father's old armchair by the fireplace. That chair had outlived every argument I'd ever had. When I was younger, I used to sit here listening to him talk about work, about people, about the differences between having money and being owned by it. He'd say, "Son, wealth's just a magnifying glass. If you're small inside, it makes you look even smaller." I never really understood that until Maria. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. 11:27 p.m. I reached for the wooden box beneath the chair, the one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were pieces of a life before ambition, an old photograph of my father standing beside a half-finished barn, a pocket knife with his initials carved into the handle, and a folded envelope, brittle from time. I'd read that letter only once before the week he died, but that night I needed to read it again. "John," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. But I need you to remember what I built wasn't for the world to see. It was for you to live freely. Don't waste it proving your worth. Money can buy your comfort, but it can't buy your character. Protect one, not both. I read those words 3 times before folding the letter back. My father had never been rich by the world's standards, but he was the wealthiest man I knew, not in things but in peace. And somewhere along the way, I'd confused the two. I'd worked so hard to build a life stable enough for someone else to love that I forgot how to love my own simplicity. Maria never stole my peace. I handed it to her, piece by piece, in the name of love. I stood and walked to the study. On the shelf sat a photo from our first year of marriage. Maria laughing, holding my hand, both of us covered in paint from the house we were remodeling. That was before the parties, before the expectations, before the quiet turned to distance. I ran my thumb over the edge of the frame. Maybe she had loved me once. Maybe I had loved the idea of being loved. Either way, we both built something on borrowed time. I opened the window. The wind carried the smell of rain-soaked earth, the kind of smell that made you remember who you were before life got complicated. I thought of the nights my father worked late, hammering wood by lantern light, humming songs nobody else would ever hear. He used to tell me, a man's worth isn't what he leaves behind. It's what he refuses to take when he walks away. And now I knew what he meant. I looked at the papers on my desk, deed statements, trust documents, all the proof of a life measured in numbers. But none of them said anything about me. None of them could tell the story of the man who built this house, or the silence that followed when the applause stopped. I tore one sheet from the stack and wrote a single line on it. All of this means nothing if I forget who I am. Then I folded it and placed it inside my father's letter. For the first time in months, I turned off my phone completely. No messages, no calls, no noise. I sat there in the dim light listening to the rain, and it hit me how quiet peace really is. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just steady. Like the heartbeat you only notice after surviving something that should have broken you. Around midnight, I walked outside to the porch. The rain had stopped. The street glistened under the lamplight, and somewhere far away a train passed through the valley. The same sound I used to hear as a boy falling asleep on the couch beside my father. Back then, life was simple. Work hard. Be kind. Sleep knowing you've earned your rest. Somewhere between then and now, I'd traded that simplicity for the noise of success. But the thing about noise, it doesn't last. The silence does. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold air, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Gratitude for the pain, for the loss, for the chance to start over without needing to win. When I went back inside, I placed the letter and the old photo beside each other on the desk. Then I whispered almost to myself, "You were right, Dad. The quiet was the fortune all along." The house creaked as if agreeing with me. I turned off the lights, left the papers untouched, and went upstairs. For the first time since Maria left, I didn't dream about her. I dreamed about building something new. Not for someone else, not to prove anything, just to make something honest again. And that I realized was the beginning of my peace. Not the end of her love story, but the rebirth of mine. The next few weeks passed without the rhythm of the life I once knew. For years my days had begun with phone calls and ended with noise, the sound of people who needed something from me. Now morning started with birds tapping the window and coffee brewed by my own hands. I learned that silence has layers. The first stings, the second steadies. The third starts to heal. I spent the early hours repairing old chairs in the garage, the same ones my father built when he was my age. The smell of sawdust replaced the scent of office air conditioning. At first, it felt like regression. Then it started feeling like recovery. Every time the chisel met the wood, I remembered that usefulness doesn't acquire with ambition. One afternoon, Sarah stopped by with some paperwork. "You've been avoiding the office," she said. "I'm not avoiding it," I told her. "I'm just giving it space to breathe." She smiled a little sadly. "They miss you." "I'll come back when I miss it too." When she left, I sat outside on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the trees. The sky burned gold at the edges. Stoic gold, I thought to myself. And I realized that the same light that once illuminated my success was now showing me something better perspective. A week later, I got a call from Elizabeth Grant, the mentor who'd once helped me secure my first contract. Her voice carried that firm gentleness only teachers have. "John," she said, "I heard about what happened. I'm not calling to console you. I'm calling because I have work that needs doing." "What kind of work?" "The kind that fixes people, not furniture." "Meet me at the community center tomorrow morning." The next day I walked into a building that smelled of chalk dust and hope. Children were painting, elderly men were sanding old tables, and a few young volunteers were learning to build shelves. Elizabeth handed me a worn apron. "You still remember how to teach, don't you?" I didn't, but I nodded anyway. By noon, I was showing a teenager how to measure wood properly. He reminded me of myself, restless, impatient, trying to prove something invisible. When he asked, "How do you know if the cut is straight?" I said, "You don't. You trust your eye. You adjust, and you accept that perfection wastes good timber." He grinned. "That sounds like life." "Exactly," I said. That night I lay awake thinking about the simplicity of it, giving time instead of advice, presence instead of money. For once, Vince wasn't tied to an account. It was in my hands again. A few days later, Elizabeth found me sweeping the workshop. "You look better," she said. "I feel lighter." "That's because you're finally Working in truth, she said. You spent years building walls that looked like homes. Now you're building homes that feel like peace. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need a response. They just settle quietly inside you. It was there in that same community hall that I met Evelyn. She was helping an old man glue the leg of a table back on. When she looked up, her smile wasn't the kind that searched for something, it was the kind that offered. Her hands were steady, her laugh unforced. She asked me where I learned carpentry. I said, from necessity. She said, that's the best school. We didn't talk about money or careers. She told me she ran a small library downtown, that she loved restoring forgotten books the way I loved restoring broken furniture. Both kinds of repair, she said, need patience and faith, that what's damaged can still be trusted. I didn't realize it then, but that was the first conversation that didn't make me measure my worth. Weeks turned into a quiet routine, teaching kids, sharing lunch with volunteers, driving home to a house that finally sounded alive in its silence. One evening, I found myself writing again, not emails, not reports, but notes, reflections, lines like, peace doesn't arrive when the noise stops. It arrives when the noise no longer needs answering. When Elizabeth read one of them, she smiled. You should publish these somewhere. They're just notes, I said. They're lessons. And lessons are what stories become when you stop trying to defend them. On the drive home, I thought about that. Maybe my story wasn't a warning about betrayal. Maybe it was proof that clarity costs, but it's worth the price. I had spent years chasing success that could be seen, only to discover that the kind that lasts is the one you can feel when no one's watching. That night, the rain came again, soft, rhythmic cleansing. I sat by the window, holding a mug of coffee gone cold, and whispered a quiet promise to myself I would never let ambition speak louder than peace again. Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one, indifferent but beautiful. Inside, I finally understood what my father meant when he said, some rebuildings are not about structures, they're about souls. And somewhere between the rain and the silence, I realized I wasn't rebuilding my life. I was rediscovering it. By late autumn, the mornings came slower, softer. Dew hung on the porch rail, like tiny glass notes waiting to be played. My hands had healed from months of sanding wood, but something inside me was still smoothing its rough edges. At the community hall, Evelyn was already there each morning, sleeves rolled up, hair tied loosely, humming the same quiet tune while stacking donated books. It wasn't romance at first. It was recognition to people learning the same language of calm after different storms. One afternoon, she found me staring at a plank that refused to fit. "You're fighting it," she said. "I'm convincing it," I answered. She smiled. "Convincing doesn't work with wood or people. You listen, then you guide. I put down the tool and laughed. You sound like my father. Then he must have been a good man. He was, I said, surprised by how easily the words came out. And I stopped being one for a while. She didn't ask for the story. She just nodded as if understanding that the details weren't as important as the lesson. That was the first time I realized healing isn't a conversation. It's a shared silence that doesn't ask for translation. Weeks passed. We restored tables, repaired shelves, and slowly built something neither of us named. On Fridays, she'd bring coffee in 2 old mugs, mismatched but faithful. And we'd sit on the steps outside while the world went on without us. She'd talk about the children who came to her library, how they'd fall asleep reading under yellow lamps. I'd talk about the house I was fixing, not for resale, not for memory, just for the simple proof that I could still make something stand. One evening, as the sky turned silver over the river, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Maria. For a long moment, I simply held it, feeling its weight, its quiet. I almost threw it into the fire, but curiosity, or maybe mercy, made me open it. John, I saw the article about your foundation. They called you the quiet architect. I suppose that fits. I don't want money. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I left. I thought youth was a door. It was a mirror. When it broke, I saw myself. The letter ended without a plea, without a signature. Just a small pressed flower, folded between the pages, the same kind she used to leave on my pillow when we were newly married. I closed the envelope and sat there for a long time, letting memory breathe but not speak. There was no anger left, only recognition. She had been chasing light the way I once chased approval. We were both guilty of worshiping reflections. That night I took the letter to the fireplace, fed it to the flame, and watched the paper curl. The smoke smelled faintly sweet like burnt perfume. It didn't feel like destruction. It felt like release. Some goodbyes, I realized, don't happen when someone leaves. They happen when you stop rehearsing what you'd say if they came back. The next morning, I told Evelyn about it. She listened quietly, then asked, "Do you feel lighter?" "I feel real," I said, like the world finally stopped echoing. She smiled. "That means you're ready. For what to live forward instead of away." Her words stayed with me. The following weeks became a rhythm, teaching, building, reading, sharing dinners that tasted of simplicity. We never labeled what was growing between us, and maybe that's why it grew. One evening, she invited me to her library's charity night. Children recited poems, old men donated their memoirs, and I found myself giving a small speech without planning to. I said books and wood have something in common. They both remember the hands that shaped them. We leave marks, not because we're perfect, but because we dared to build. The room went silent for a breath, the kind of silence that feels like respect rather than absence. When I stepped down, Evelyn handed me a cup of tea instead of applause. For the man who finally stopped fixing everything except himself, she said. Driving home, I realized how far I'd come from the man who once measured worth in applause. Peace doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly and waits to see if you'll choose it. And that night, for the first time, I did. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw the porch light flickering. It used to annoy me. Now it felt alive, like the house was exhaling. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, and whispered, "Thank you, Maria." Not for what she took, but for what she left me with space. I went inside, poured 2 mugs of coffee, though only one would be used, and set the other across from me. The chair opposite stayed empty, but somehow it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a conversation still happening between who I was and who I was becoming. Outside, winter crept out through the streets, quiet and patient. Inside, I wrote a single line in my notebook. Some endings don't close. They clear the fog so the real road can begin. And as I set the pen down, I realized the fog was lifting. Winter came early that year, the kind of cold that hums through the walls before you hear it outside. The mornings turned silver, the air sharp, and every sound in the house carried further than it used to. I'd started lighting the fireplace again, mostly for the warmth, partly for the company. The chair across from mine still waited, but it no longer asked for anyone. Evelyn and I kept busy at the center. We organized a holiday drive, repaired old shelves for the local library, and delivered food baskets to families who'd lost more than I ever did. It felt right to be useful again without needing applause. One evening, after the last delivery, Evelyn stood beside me outside her car. "You know," she said, "you have the kind of peace people notice even when you're silent." I smiled. It wasn't free. She touched my arm gently. "Nothing worth keeping ever is." That night, as I drove home, snow began to fall soft, unhurried. The city was quiet in that holy way it gets before Christmas. I parked in front of the house and noticed an unfamiliar car down the street. The engine was off, but its taillights glowed faint red in the fog. I didn't think much of it until I saw the figure inside, a woman, still shoulders shaking. Something in me knew before I reached the window. It was Maria. Her hands were buried in her lap, clutching a worn coat that looked 2 sizes too thin for the cold. When she saw me, she stepped out, her breath blooming white in the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. 10 years of marriage, 1 year of distance, and now this silence. It was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. "John," she said finally, "I didn't know where else to go." I looked at her, the same eyes now rimmed with exhaustion. The woman who once demanded chandeliers, and Paris now stood under a street lamp, shaking from the December wind. "You shouldn't be here," I said softly. "I know, but I needed to tell you something before Christmas." I let her inside. She sat by the fire, warming her hands like a stranger in someone else's story. For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of burning wood. Then she spoke. "I read about the foundation you started, the scholarships, the hospitals. You did all that quietly, like always. I didn't do it to prove anything. I said." "I know," she whispered. "That's what makes it harder to live with." She reached into her purse and handed me a folded envelope. "It's a letter I wrote months ago but couldn't send. My lawyer said I should ask you for money. I didn't. I'm not here for that. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I destroyed." I set the envelope aside. "You don't owe me apologies, Maria. I owe myself one," she said, eyes glistening. "I thought love was comfort. Turns out it was courage. And I never had any." We sat in silence again. Outside, the snow kept falling thick and quiet. She looked around the living room, at the same shelves, the meme furniture she'd once decorated to impress others. "You kept everything the same," she said. "No," I replied. "I just stopped changing things that never needed fixing." When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated by the door. "There's someone else, isn't there?" "There's peace," I said, and she helped me find it. She nodded slowly, tears balancing in her eyes. "Then you did what I couldn't." At the doorway, she turned one last time. "I don't expect forgiveness, John, but I hope someday you'll remember me as someone who tried to understand before it was too late." I wanted to say something kind, something final, but words would have only cheapened the truth. So I simply said, "Drive safe." After she left, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear into the snow, its taillights bleeding into the white. I waited until the red faded completely before closing the curtains. Then I sat back by the fire and opened her letter. It wasn't long, just a single line written in her neat handwriting. "You once told me that silence was your favorite sound. Now I know why it's the only thing honest enough to forgive you when the world won't." I folded the letter and placed it in the same box that held my father's. Two pieces of my past resting side by side. Both lessons written in different handwriting saying the same thing. Some things you only own once you let them go. The next day I didn't tell Evelyn about Maria's visit. Not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. The kind of truth that needed to settle quietly before being shared. When she saw me sanding a new frame at the center, she asked, "What are you building this time?" Something that finally fits, I said. That night, as snow covered the city in white forgiveness, I felt it the calm after the longest storm. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply run out of power. Maria's shadow would always linger somewhere behind me, but now it felt like shade, not darkness. And for the first time since she left, I understood what peace actually sounded like. Not the absence of her voice, but the presence of mine. The evening after the funeral, the snow stopped falling. The world looked washed quiet, like it had been waiting for someone to finally stop talking. I stood on the porch of my cabin, the one place that had outlasted everything. Ambition, love, betrayal, and watched the light fade behind the ridge. The sky turned that familiar gradient from warm gold to cool gray, the color of endings that finally make sense. I'd left the service early. There had been only 6 people there, and none of them really knew her. No long speeches, no music, just the sound of wind against the chapel windows. When the priest asked if anyone wanted to say something, I had stood up and said a single line. She once taught me how expensive illusions can be. There was no bitterness in it, just truth. Some lessons cost everything, but they still teach. Now back at the cabin, I poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one across the table. Old habits die like old ghosts, slow, but not painfully. The fire cracked, the room breathed, and I felt the strange calm of a life finally emptied of noise. I opened the box where I had kept my father's letter and Maria's final note. The paper edges had yellowed slightly, but their words still carried the same gravity. Protect your peace, but not from mercy. For the first time, I understood what he meant. Mercy isn't weakness. It's the last proof that life hasn't hardened you. When my phone buzzed, I almost ignored it. Then I saw Evelyn's name. We're lighting the tree at the center. The kids asked if you'd read something. I stared at the message for a while before replying, on my way. The drive into town was slow. The road shimmered with thin ice, and the world glowed with the kind of stillness that only comes when people are too tired to pretend. When I arrived, the community hall was alive with soft laughter and the smell of cinnamon. Children chased each other between tables, and volunteers strung garlands across the old windows. Evelyn stood near the tree, her hair touched with silver light, her hands guiding a little boy as he tried to hang a paper star. When she saw me, she smiled, not surprised, just warm, as if she had known I'd come all along. "You're late," she said gently. "I was saying goodbye to someone," I replied. Her smile softened. "Then say something for the rest of us." I walked to the small stage, and the room hushed. Dozens of faces looked up, some expectant, some just tired, but hopeful. I didn't have notes. I didn't need them. I used to believe, peace was what you found after everything was fixed, I began. But I've learned it's what you find when you stop trying to fix everything. Life doesn't hand us perfect stories. It hands us people choices and chances to make meaning out of both. And sometimes it takes losing what you loved to remember what you are. A child somewhere in the back asked, "Are you sad?" I smiled. "No, I'm grateful. Sadness is just gratitude wearing the wrong coat." The audience laughed softly, and someone began clapping, hesitant at first, then steady. Evelyn looked at me the way sunlight looks at the morning, quietly proud that it showed up again. Afterward, we stepped outside. The snow had begun to fall again, slow, deliberate, forgiving. She slipped her arm through mine, and we walked without words. The street lamps cast golden halos across the path, and I realized that peace, like snow, doesn't erase what's beneath it. It just covers it gently until you're ready to face it again. Evelyn stopped halfway down the street. "You're different now," she said. "I'm just quieter." "No," she replied. "You're finally listening to yourself." We reached the edge of the park where the frozen pond reflected the lights like constellations. I watched my breath disappear into the night and thought about all the versions of myself I had been: the builder, the provider, the husband, the man who mistook silence for safety. They were all still there, somewhere beneath the snow, but smaller now, forgiven. I used to think forgiveness was about letting the other person go, I said softly. And now, she asked, now I know it's about freeing the part of yourself that kept waiting for an apology. She didn't answer. She just leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stood there in the kind of silence that doesn't ache, it heals. When I got home that night, the house felt different. Not emptier, just lighter. I turned off the lights, opened the window, and let the winter air in. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed through the valley, its horn low and distant, carrying the home sound my father once called the voice of time itself. I whispered, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the quiet that had stayed when everyone else left." On the desk, my notebook lay open to the last thing I'd written. Peace isn't the end of the story. It's the moment you stop needing one. I closed it gently. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, patient, eternal. And inside, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was surviving my past. I felt like I was keeping it company. Until the morning came. The evening after the funeral, the snow stopped falling. The world looked washed, quiet, like it had been waiting for someone to finally stop talking. I stood on the porch of my cabin, the one place that had outlasted everything: ambition, love, betrayal, and watched the light fade behind the ridge. The sky turned that familiar gradient from warm gold to cool gray, the color of endings that finally make sense. I'd left the service early. There had been only 6 people there, and none of them really knew her. No long speeches, no music, just the sound of wind against the chapel windows. When the priest asked if anyone wanted to say something, I had stood up and said a single line. She once taught me how expensive illusions can be. There was no bitterness in it, just truth. Some lessons cost everything, but they still teach. Now back at the cabin, I poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one across the table. Old habits die like old ghosts, slow, but not painfully. The fire cracked, the room breathed, and I felt the strange calm of a life finally emptied of noise. I opened the box where I had kept my father's letter and Maria's final note. The paper edges had yellowed slightly, but their words still carried the same gravity. Protect your peace, but not from mercy. For the first time, I understood what he meant. Mercy isn't weakness. It's the last proof that life hasn't hardened you. When my phone buzzed, I almost ignored it. Then I saw Evelyn's name. We're lighting the tree at the center. The kids asked if you'd read something. I stared at the message for a while before replying, on my way. The drive into town was slow. The roads shimmered with thin ice, and the world glowed with a kind of stillness that only comes when people are too tired to pretend. When I arrived, the community hall was alive with soft laughter and the smell of cinnamon. Children chased each other between tables, and volunteers strung garlands across the old windows. Evelyn stood near the tree, her hair touched with silver light, her hands guiding a little boy as he tried to hang a paper star. When she saw me, she smiled, not surprised, just warm, as if she had known I'd come all along. You're late, she said gently. I was saying goodbye to someone, I replied. Her smile softened. Then say something for the rest of us. I walked into the small stage, and the room hushed. Dozens of faces looked up, some expectant, some just tired, but hopeful. I didn't have notes. I didn't need them. I used to believe peace was what you found after everything was fixed, I began. But I've learned it's what you find when you stop trying to fix everything. Life doesn't hand us perfect stories. It hands us people choices and chances to make meaning out of both. And sometimes it takes losing what you loved to remember what you are. A child somewhere in the back asked, "Are you sad?" I smiled. "No, I'm grateful. Sadness is just gratitude wearing the wrong coat." The audience laughed softly, and someone began clapping, hesitant at first, then steady. Evelyn looked at me the way sunlight looks at the morning, quietly proud that it showed up again. Afterward, we stepped outside. The snow had begun to fall again, slow, deliberate, forgiving. She slipped her arm through mine, and we walked without words. The street lamps cast golden halos across the path, and I realized that peace, like snow, doesn't erase what's beneath it. It just covers it gently until you're ready to face it again. Evelyn stopped halfway down the street. "You're different now," she said. I'm just quieter. No, she replied. You're finally listening to yourself. We were on the edge of the park where the frozen pond reflected the lights like constellations. I watched my breath disappear into the night and thought about all the versions of myself. I had been the builder, the provider, the husband, the man who mistook silence for safety. They were all still there, somewhere beneath the snow, but smaller, now forgiven. I used to think forgiveness was about letting the other person go. I said softly. And now, she asked. Now I know. It's about freeing the part of yourself that kept waiting for an apology. She didn't answer. She just leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stood there in the kind of silence that doesn't ache, it heals. When I got home that night, the house felt different. Not emptier, just lighter. I turned off the lights, opened the window, and let the winter air in. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed through the valley, its horn low and distant, carrying the same sound my father once called the voice of time itself. I whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, just to the quiet that had stayed when everyone else left. On the desk, my notebook lay open to the last thing I'd written. Peace isn't the end of the story. It's the moment you stop in needing one. I closed it gently. Outside, the snow kept falling soft, patient, eternal. And inside, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was surviving my past. I felt like I was keeping it company until the morning came.